Good morning, everybody. It is a beautiful Friday morning, and this week I'm going to be going into a little bit more depth on chapter 19 and 20, the last two chapters of the Shattuck and Catron. Chapter 19 covered pacing, rhythm, and tempo, between which I will differentiate. And chapter 20 had a lot of really good diagnostic clues for how to fix something going a little off in a rehearsal. Once more, I'd like to apologize for the fan outside of where I live. First off, we're going to start differentiating between what rhythm, tempo, and pacing are as defined by Shattuck and Catron. What I particularly enjoyed was when it comes to rhythm, I've always considered that mostly having to do with poetic excerpts, or if we're talking about something like Shakespeare or Moliere. But they define it as just a series of sounds, and this can be lines, this can be things that make noise within the show, and there are elements of delivery when referring to rhythm that can talk about the urgency. It can kind of clue in any differences in thought, which we're also going to talk about later through pacing. Tempo, of course, refers to the speed. How fast is it going? Why is it going fast or slow? And pace is the differentiation of your tempo and your rhythm that can also be identified as beats in a show. Now, why all this rhythmic talk when talking about how you deliver a line? It sounds much more like you're talking about being in a symphony orchestra, right? Well, the rhythm, the tempo, and the pacing are all delivery aspects when referring to the lines themselves. Just like how a piece of music is played. If it's played too slow, it's very noticeable, right? Especially if it's a piece that people understand to have a particular feel to it. That can kind of make or break whatever the feel of your show is. But my favorite aspect of this particular chapter was defining pace as the differences between, and how you can connect this to the beats and figuring out your motivation for why your delivery would be shifting. As an actor who was trained much more in the Stanislavski method, this is a really good way to show how to communicate these characterization and motivation work analyses that you've been doing with your actors to an audience. This is the most direct way. So I appreciated the differentiation so that you can clearly talk with your actors about, hey, can we pick up the pace on here, or can we do a pace shift whenever we're addressing these to show that change in thought. Chapter 20 had much more of a diagnostic feel when talking about problems in rehearsal. And the biggest issues that I've ever had in rehearsal, because there are so many issues covered in this chapter, so I'm just going to go with two particular ones. One is a combination of two different ones addressed in the book, where the rehearsal seems kind of stale because they've done it over and over and over again, and also where it just starts feeling like they don't really want to do it anymore. The second has to do with body language and line delivery. So this one, even though it's covered by multiple ones in the chapter, it's kind of a big one that I'd like to kind of isolate into several smaller ones as well. So for the first one, reminding for many of you, I work at a school where theater, at least in the middle school, is not it's something you have to take. It's not an elective. So naturally, you're going to have people who, after a while, don't want to do it anymore. But more than this, I noticed that as a theater teacher, the onus is definitely on us. If it feels like we are exhausted, or if it feels like we no longer value it, then the cast is no longer going to value it, which made me think what happened during A Midsummer Night's Dream. During the rehearsal process, I did get sick, and so I wasn't there for a couple of rehearsals in a row, and then when I got back, I was still getting over it, so I was quite exhausted. This is not something that I explained to my students, though. And also we had a couple of distracting elements that, because of the time structure, I didn't want them missing rehearsal, so I often wouldn't send them out for their distracting behavior. This is something I completely own on me. That's something I definitely should have done a lot earlier, because then after a while, the others who were taking it seriously were getting frustrated with this distracting element. And so before these other distracting people realized, oh, we're going to be in front of people, and that kind of lit a fire under their butt, we were dealing with a lot of, why am I even here, from a lot of students. And so that is something that I completely own and will do a much better job of through classroom management and through the teachery things that we have also all been trained in. Now we're going to get to body language and line delivery next. So body language predominantly dealing with gestures like this, a lot of the hand slapping of the legs kind of a thing, gestures that don't mean anything, or things that like kids think that they're being artistic and they're just doing this over and over again. This was a problem that I had too as a kid. So what I really liked was how they identified going back over, especially with gesture and action particularly, to specify what it is you're trying to communicate, going back to the analysis and then looking at the blocking through the lens of your analysis. Now, analysis is something that I do introduce to kids at this age. And so going back to the idea of motivation, tactics, and objectives whenever you're dealing with the scene and whether or not that objective is being met, right? So your actions are then going to be something, if you physically do them, they're going to show a lot about what your tactics are. So I thought this was a really good idea of going back over and saying, hey, okay, so what is the order of your tactics? Getting them to think a little bit deeper about the specificity of what it is that they are doing as their character, so that this will also help them to stay more in the moment and do less gestures that don't make a lot of sense. But I was happy with how the kids that did initially start with these gestures that don't make a lot of sense at least attempted something, because that was something that all year I had been trying to, like, it was like pulling teeth, trying to get kids to try things and not be afraid to mess up. So now the next part for me will be trying to figure out how best to communicate to these students of like, hey, I loved your choice there. I loved where you went with that, but can you explain to me why, so we can clearly communicate through your analysis why you decided to do that? Because getting these kids to think specifically is the next step once they start trying things. The next has to do with lines, specifically in regards to speeches. I don't know if you've ever seen a middle school show, most of you probably have, where they just want to get through the line as quickly as possible and get off stage. And it's very clear that that is what they are trying to do. This is where your rhythm, tempo, and pacing can come in when you're talking about line delivery. For instance, we just had, whenever we did A Midsummer Night's Dream, our Oberon really needed help with, okay, he has a lot of speeches in there. He has the incantation for the magic spell initially. He also has a lot of things where he notices, and he's the one who directly meddles in the lives of the mortals through Puck as well. So we have to figure out what motivates him to do that and what motivates him to do really any of the long speeches that he's doing. So I pulled my actor aside, and he did a really good job of taking the notes that I gave him regarding Oberon, and because he's the one who sees Demetrius's crappy treatment of Helena while they're running through the woods. And the way that our actor actually said that he saw Oberon was somebody who, even though he is an authoritative figure, he made him kind of a feminist. He made it to where he sees this mistreatment, and that's what motivates him to go, oh, heck no, that's not how you treat ladies. Which I thought was a hilarious way of doing this, considering he had been fighting with Titania the entire time. But it also kind of shows how people are sometimes like that, right? We don't necessarily see the flaws in ourselves. And so I let him go with this motivation behind why he wanted to set the spell in the first place. It wasn't just about Titania, it was also about teaching guys to be better. So we did this through the use of beats. Now, whenever he tells Puck to go get him this flower, and he sees this mistreatment of Helena, okay, where he sees, in our version, Demetrius actually pushes Helena down to try to say, hey, look, I need you to leave me alone. And Oberon takes that rather to heart. So whenever Puck comes back in, he considers it for a moment, and we said, hey, I want you to make this your moment where you decide it is more than just about Titania here. So we had him take that time and really consider that flower, and he did a lot of great micro expressions because we tracked step by step what his thought process should be. And this kind of also refers to action a little bit, but I was really appreciative that this young actor was willing to use micro expression and communicate those a little bit bigger so that the audience could see what he was thinking about without being presentational about it. It looked very, very sincere. Then what he did was that he handed this to Puck and made sure that Puck understood, hey, listen, there's a guy who's being a real jerk out there to a woman who absolutely fawns on and dotes on him. So I need you to fix this. Our Puck kind of took the initially because he didn't know that we were changing the meaning behind some of the delivery. So I just told Puck to listen and react. And this created a really interesting dynamic between Puck and Oberon, because Puck at first was very confused. Like, Oberon, I thought we were just going to mess with your wife. And he was a little confused about it, but he was also like, okay, well, you're the boss. And I thought this set up a very interesting character dynamic between Puck and Oberon. And it's all because our actors took the notes that I gave them and were very, very specific in their analysis. But all of this really would not have been possible if I hadn't really skimmed the chapter 20 ahead of time during the rehearsal process, because this gave me some great, very specific things to do to fix some of the problems that we were having in rehearsal. So I'm very grateful.